Whether you're drawing your OC sipping a pumpkin spice latte for our autumn group photo, taking some lessons in our Tuesday workshop sessions, or getting spooky with our Halloween draw jams, the Screen Tones community has a full calendar of fall fun. Go to screentonescast.com to see everything we're doing and click that Discord icon to join in yourself.
Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true!
Hello and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about ending a webcomic. I'm Rennie, I use she, they pronouns, and I'm working on the webcomic Aetherstar.
My name's Crispy, I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomics Ghost Junk Sickness and Lunar Blight.
And I'm Verathane, I use she, they pronouns, and I make the webcomics Geralt and Witchwood.
So webcomics can come to a stop for a whole host of reasons. Sometimes creators don't get to choose those reasons, as life or circumstances can get in the way, but let's say it's smooth sailing and everything goes to plan. At some point, you will reach the end of your story, or a natural stopping point at least. However you choose to tie up all these loose ends can take a little effort that you don't always anticipate, so we're going to talk about it. So I guess, what has been the two of you's experience with ending a webcomic? How did it feel to get there, and how'd you know it was time?
Wow. I'm really excited about this episode just because we have like really different experiences as far as this is concerned. Thane finishing a webcomic quite a bit ago, and me during this recording of this episode, I just finished my webcomic, and I don't know. I mean, I haven't finished uploading it publicly is the difference. When I say that I've ended a webcomic, that means production for me. So we did finish production on Ghost Junk Sickness in August of this year.
Woo!
2024. Yeah, pretty exciting. And I think we really wanted to wrap it up for like a production of 10 years. So this year, not only did we hit 10 years, but we were like, no, we got to finish it kind of thing. It's an interesting feeling. I know that this is not like the end of like that story too, but you know, it was kind of emotional to be like, oh, this is the last time I'm going to be inking like this comic for the main story, or the last time I'm going to letter it again for the main story. So that was kind of emotional. Like as far as like how did we know it was time? I work on Ghost Junk Sickness with my sister Space, and we've been planning this, you know, several years before we kind of got started, and it's always had like an outline of like beginning, middle, end. And as you're kind of creating it, that ending is going to change because you change, and 10 years with production, that's a long time. That is an absolute long time. And us changing as people kind of affected like what happens in the middle, but the core stayed the same. So I always knew like how it was gonna end in some like big major moments that we were gonna kind of cover in the story. So, you know, we always knew a ballpark of, you know, quote unquote when it was time to kind of end. Um, you know, looking back at what we were doing, um, Ghost Junk was originally supposed to be 9 books, and there was a part in production where we were like, we already have like 5 books printed, and it's a lot. Like having like Ghost Junk Sickness as a complete series is 7 books long. And that's a lot to kind of carry around at cons, if that's your thing too, because not all webcomics need to be printed. But for us, it's like, wow, 7 book series that's a lot to kind of carry around as far as indie creators go. And so when we were kind of like going around in the con circuit, and we had brought volumes 1 to 6, like it was a different vibe as opposed to like bringing volumes 1 to 3, where it doesn't feel like as big of as an investment for like new people to jump into the series, be like, oh yeah, I can buy all 3 books and whatever. But when you're like, oh yeah, it's a 7-book series, like you do get like a bit of a, there is a difference in sales, I will say that. So that was something that kind of helped us reevaluate what we were doing with the story and being like, are we dragging things out, and are there things that we can kind of condense so that the main story, you know, exists in its bulk form, in its like an entire thematic purpose, and then we can extrapolate in like smaller stories. And so like that was the thing that we were thinking a lot about, and kind of helped us change our decisions as far as like where to end it and how we knew it was time. Like I knew that the few chapters, so book 7 again was supposed to be much longer. We cut like hundreds of pages, and I think it was chapter 22, it was supposed to be like almost 100 pages long, and we cut like so many pages from it, and now we're going to kind of recycle the adventure that was going to happen there to a side story, so that like they still exist because we like the concepts, but we're just gonna kind of reuse them so that it's not, I'm not gonna say like the story's going on forever, but like I don't know, when it started hitting 7 volumes, it was like, this is just a lot because our goal is to print it and to sell it at cons. So that was kind of the deciding factor for us.
So a lot of, weighing practicality with storytelling and just going, okay, what do we actually need to get the themes and tone that we want to send at the end, right?
Yeah. And like I often think about like we did change as people as the story was being made. So like I look back at like specifically like chapter 3 of my comic, and I'm like, oh man, like the pacing is so much different than how we handle pacing now. You know what I mean? And like
Yeah.
if I think that if the me now was writing that, like the beginning kind of parts of Ghost Junk, I'd be like, we tackle this differently. Not that I would. We're gonna leave it the way it is because I like growth in webcomics, and I don't want to get stuck in like, oh, we gotta fix it to who we are now. I just think that that's not my style. But it does make me
That
reflect.
can be digging a hole to fill another hole.
Yeah. Yeah, because then, you know, then I'll be like, "Oh, like, this is exciting. I've changed it to that, so I'm gonna go for another chapter," and blah, 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 blah. Like, I want it to be done, and it
Yeah.
is. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah. What about you, Thane?
It's funny. I know we said like it was a different experience, but there's a lot of commonalities between what I went through
I can
finishing Geralt.
imagine.
I mean, it's another like extremely long story that I started when I was quite young and took like over a decade to finish. When I first kind of, I feel like the process of ending it started about halfway through. And it also kind of came about like that sort of mindset shift was when I was kind of getting into printing it. Because I had made volume 1 and I did the Kickstarter and I printed it and I was like, cool, now I have a book. And then sort of the secondary realization, which was something that I always had in my mind but didn't feel real, was like, oh yeah, I'm making a book. And books have a finite amount of pages. And when you finish those pages,
Mm.
there should be something that feels ending like. And I kind of really started like looking at my story with a bit more of a critical eye, because when I started I was just writing organically and kind of coming up with things like as I went. I would be like, this would be fun, what if they have this adventure next, what if they have this adventure next. I was kind of picturing it as like a monster of the week story that I could just keep doing forever, but I really wanted an overarching plot line. And I hadn't really put like, other than putting a lot of thought into the characters and the setting and like the intricacies of what was happening, the kind of superstructure of the whole story was not something that I really thought too much about until I was drawing the pages that have become volume 3, and I was starting to think about where I was going to split like for volume 2. I was like, I have this big bunch of like 300 pages, and to make this all one book is it's big. Actually, it was more like 500 pages. Anyway, I was like, this is too many. It's going to be expensive. It was really expensive to print at that time. Like the more pages you added, and you couldn't do custom sizes. There were a whole bunch of other like things that have become easier since then. But printing a 500-page book is still a lot. It's just a lot, and it wouldn't feel good to hold in your hands. It would be really heavy. The spine would be really thick. So I was like, I need to cut this in half. But where the heck can I cut this? Because I had not given myself any good places to kind of close that narrative. And part of my issue was like there were some the continuation of the kind of monster of the weakest chapters, and then it launched into this massive action sequence that just kind of did not really end for like 150 pages. And I was like, oh, I don't want to end it like in the middle of that, and I don't want to cut it before because I want volume 2 to be longer than volume 1, and I don't want to cut it like if I cut it too late. It was a whole thing. I was like, what am I going to do with like this sequence? And then after kind of planning that out, I ended up settling on like a cutting point for that sequence. But it did make me kind of reevaluate like the whole thing, because I was like, wait a minute, if I keep this story going, I'm just going to keep like if I don't change the way I'm approaching this, I'm just going to keep hitting this this exact problem over and over and over again, and I might end up having to make an infinite number of books if I don't start wrapping things up. And I was looking at how many pages I had and like how many books that would end up being if I didn't like make the page count longer. So just in general, I was like, I want this story to conclude at some point, and I want it to conclude within like a reasonable time frame, and not to be too much more than 1,000 pages, which at the time seemed like it still seemed like a big number. It ended up clocking in at about 1,200 pages, and got printed over 5 volumes. But I feel like I started actively thinking about the ending during volume 3. And it was kind of, once I made that mindset shift, it was kind of exhilarating and scary at the same time, because it was like realizing that all these little story threads that I'd been sort of joyfully dropping all over the place, like what if there's this character, what if there's like, this little like plot nugget that happens, and like, ooh, it can drop intrigue for later, this like nebulous later that I hadn't really like thought too hard about. Um,
And then when later becomes now.
yeah, I was like, oh, I actually should be thinking about later, because later it's gonna show up. I need to have a
And
plan.
then later you will be cursing past you.
Yes, I put down a lot of threads, and when I hit that kind of halfway point, I was like, all right, I gotta start picking the threads back up and tying them together and answering some of the questions that I introduced in the plot, and having the characters start to realize their goals. And in order to do that, the other kind of additional corollary is I need to know what those questions and goals are. So yeah, that was kind of the biggest changes. And yeah, realizing it was time was definitely coming from the experience of printing it and seeing it as a book, and thinking a little bit to the future. And it felt scary. Eventually, it felt really good.
I think that's just the general mood of ending any creative work, is the scary part followed by the relief of, oh, this, I don't have to do this anymore, or oh, it's done, or oh, I finally have it finished. And then later you get to go, ah, I finished it. That was nice. Let's forget how hard I worked. So, as you both mentioned, that there were lots of challenges along the way to getting to that finish line. What were the biggest ones that you experienced on your journey to the end?
Um, well, I think just kind of the scope is always a big one with webcomics, just because like Thane was mentioning, like when you're doing a webcomic and you're uploading it onto the interwebs, you're kind of like page number who kind of thing, and you just kind of go and do whatever. It's not the same structure as something you would print, or a graphic novel or whatever. They kind of have their own, not rules, but just ways.
The bandwidth is much wider, where like for like printing you would go, okay, this book has to be less than 10 volumes or else my suitcase is going to explode.
Yeah.
Whereas for web comics that are just on the web, it's whatever the storage space of your website is,
Mm-hmm.
which is functionally for a webcomic infinite because we work with JPEGs.
Yeah.
So it's that difference of real numbers versus funny numbers.
Yeah. And it was interesting when, like we had mentioned before about like putting it to print and changing the format, because that is a change of format. So for Ghost Junk, it was always like planned to be a printed book, and printed series. So the format specifically is going to be different as opposed to like uploading it for the web, and just kind of going from there and seeing where you kind of go for the feelings and stuff. So for our story, like we always planned stuff to have arcs and to finish it in a certain amount of pages so that it would fit nicely in volumes. And so, we kind of like just focused it from that. The challenges that you kind of run into from that is going to be like finishing a scene on time so that you are under like that certain page number count sort of thing. So like fitting moments or arcs or whatever, making sure that it's like sufficient enough to get a point across. And again, satisfying to read, because like, you can have like stuff that is going into print and it could feel really awkward with the way that it's cut in the story to fit into a volume, because like Thane was mentioning, like you don't want to have something that's like 500 pages and very unwieldy. Like, hot take from me, but like a lot of the re-releases of the omnibus styles that they're doing for like manga, I just do not like reading those at all, just because of how huge and unwieldy they are. And also they're expensive to print. So when you're kind of focusing on like, I want to have something that's like a graphic novel length of like maybe 200 to 250 pages, maybe pushing 300 if you're getting spicy enough. There's a lot of pacing to consider, and there's stuff that kind of suffers from that. And again, like what I said in the first question about like kind of thinking about how I write older stuff now, I definitely think I have a better grasp on some of the pacing. Maybe some of it's going a little bit quicker than I would like to, just because we've cut a lot of stuff from it, like story wise or character arc wise. But I don't know, I think like in the end, as far as the complete story of Ghost Junk Sickness in its entirety, I'm pretty happy with it. I don't think that we were expecting kind of wrangling ourselves back and forth with like how much we had to do, and like to kind of get over a lot of those challenges, what we used to do, because like I work with another person, so that is definitely an advantage that not everybody has. But before we would start chapters, like we would both review like the script when we started writing one instead of putting it all in thumbnails. God, that was bad. So the process definitely changed a lot over time.
Another moment where future you goes back and goes, nope.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Like when we used to have the thumbnails, all of our script was written in tiny, tiny, tiny like pencil, like physical pencil on paper. I don't know why. And then we're like, wow, the
Well,
book
because
has
pencil and paper feels good.
it does. And
It hits the serotonin for us.
it's great to see like the thumbnails like from like above, like stepping back and seeing how they flow into each other. But writing our script into that was like very silly, just because like our comic was like riddled with spelling mistakes and stuff like that, just because we use Clip Studio, or at the time Photoshop Elements 8 and it didn't have like anything to correct what we were putting in. But
Blasted back to the past.
yeah. Now we always script it out, and so we try to get those spelling mistakes caught. But like I was saying before, just figuring out what makes sense and how to fit it in a book, it was challenging, because you were just like, oh, I really like oh, like you get an idea and you're like, oh, what if we start exploring like this character's tragic past? But it's like I mean, we could, but that's like another 30 pages. Do we really want to do that? And, how do we get that point across emotionally, but also like sufficiently? So there was a lot of that. And again, like I said in my first question, like we can take a lot of those cool ideas and put them in side stories. And I think that's just as valuable.
And side stories can just be done whenever you want at your own leisure, and that's less stress. And those can be more fun or experimental. Thane, what about you? What were some of the big challenges you had when ending Chirol?
Well, the first thing I wrote in my notes for this section is me reaping versus me sowing, and that's definitely what it felt like.
Reaping, yeah.
Like,
Sowing, no.
oh boy, it was oh no, it was sowing versus reaping. I got it mixed up. Anyway,
Oh, I did too.
the whole meme, it's like I was having fun, having a blast, like just I'm an organic writer, and during Tyrol I was definitely just kind of plowing forward like with a very loose plan. And I had to get much more organized once I kind of sat down and was like, I'm ending this thing. So all of my kind of note taking, that side of the process just immediately like got way more like elaborate. I also had it was also just difficult like both at the in terms of like the process itself was a challenge because I had to look at all the pieces of my story like a huge puzzle and figure out how they fit together, and really think about like what are the questions that I've asked, how am I going to wrap these up, and it was like also kind of tough like emotionally as I was going through it, because part of what had made my process prior to that work was just that kind of pure like I'm just gonna go for it and do what feels the most fun in the moment. And I kind of as I worked on it, it like 5 years went by before I kind of hit that point, and over those 5 years I kind of changed my tastes. I grew up a little bit. I like outgrew my initial outline of the story, and the way that I approached that was just like, well, I'm going to trash it and I'm just going to start like a new thing. I'm going to like introduce something else that feels really interesting to me. And I was keeping myself invested in the story with these like changes, like these kind of fundamental, like just moving things around under the surface and putting new meaning into the pieces that were there before. But once I was in kind of that end game prep, it like I was it was much more rigid, and I didn't have that kind of freedom anymore, and it just got more and more rigid the closer I got to the actual ending. So I was like scripting things and then I was drawing them like 2 years later. And prior to that point, if I wrote a script and I was like not keen on it, I could like completely change things and just not do that scene or something, but I no longer had that kind of freedom to tweak things. I was committed to like drawing this stuff, and it just kind of started feeling like, especially towards the very end of the story, it would feel like this is I'm excited to be done this, like just on a like it's starting to feel like work. And then once I actually was done it, I was like, oh, it actually was pretty solid. Like looking back on it, like it was definitely like I love the
Mm.
process and I'm proud of what I made like overall at the end of the day. But like the last probably year of working on it definitely felt the hardest, just like to keep going, I guess. There it was like I'm in too deep. I can't stop now. I'm so close, but definitely it was like an emotion that I had not been having about the story prior to that. So it was kind of interesting, just that part of the process I didn't really expect. But there were some fun parts to that side of things as well, because it was a lot of like finding like trying to remember all the foreshadowing that I'd planted in the story and try to make sure that I addressed it, like bring that back. Like, wait, I put that thing into chapter 5, like that implied that this was relevant somehow to this other character's backstory or to something that would be important to my end game. And a lot of that was really fun, like kind of pulling that stuff out, and like going through the story over and over. And sometimes it would be like surprising things, like something that I'd put in without like I didn't think it was foreshadowing. And then at the end, I was like, ooh, I can use this. It was like a little treat that I gave myself in the future.
I was just gonna ask, like, because I'm sure both you and Crispy have had this, where, like, probably many times where you had things where you're like, "Yes, it's been all planned all along," and then things where it's like, "Oh, this has been here the whole time. Oh, yeah, it's been planned all along."
It was right under my nose. I definitely meant it to be there. And no, I will not go into detail about which things fall into this category.
We keep having that happen with our stuff where I'm just like, oh my god, it's a thematic parallel. Yes, we meant that. Haha. It feels good.
And the other thing I wanted to say was, like, I know, like, I wanted to follow up on the point of like you in the weeds of it versus you in the, afterwards, saying, talking about how in the weeds it can feel a lot more daunting, and you have this pressure on you to, oh, I have to stick the landing, I have to get this right. And then afterwards you have that separation to go, oh yeah, no, what was I worrying about? This is fine, this is great. And it can be really hard to remember that is the
Mm.
normal progression when you're in the weeds.
Yeah, the stakes definitely felt like really high towards the end there. I was like, every page that I do matters so much. And like, technically, the beginning, arguably, those pages matter more. Like, that's the first thing that readers are encountering. That is the setup. That's the thing. But like, it didn't feel like it at the time. I was just experiencing the pure joy of making the thing. Whereas later, there were all these layers of like, this has to serve, like this has to address this and this and this and this, and like all these other considerations that like get added on to the late game pages.
Mm-hmm.
Our final question for the night is, what is your advice for someone starting to get to the end? What, like, someone's approaching the end of their webcomic, what are the things that they need to think about?
That's a tough question. I think a lot of the things that they should consider is, like, I guess what the overall impact that you are kind of writing towards. I know we talked about landing it and stuff, but like that's really out of our hands, to be quite honest. Like, they're kind of,
Of course, yeah.
yeah, they're gonna enjoy it the way that they do. And it's just, yeah, a lot of it comes down to how you're approaching it and what you're hoping for the audience to kind of do, and for yourself. Like, this is an emotional part of you also finishing something that is being posted live. So you're all kind of going through the motions together as a big group. It's weird, like with webcomics doing that. And I guess, like, as far as advice is concerned about that, is just you really shouldn't beat yourself up too harshly about it. Like, I have conversations with my peers about, like, the writing the ending and it's gonna be epic sauce and I hope I make people cry and stuff, and I'm like, that's nice and all, um but I don't know, like, I think everybody wants something very impactful and whatnot, but I don't think that the ending needs to encompass all of that. Like, there could be something that happens in the middle of the story that defines it as a whole, or even in the beginning and stuff like that. Like, there's other, like, merits to its worth, as far as the story goes. And I think, like, a lot of people um really want that, like, oh, amazing ending, because unfortunately, like, people also reflect on an ending can just ruin the whole thing, which, I don't know, it's a little controversial to me personally as a writer. I think I can like something that has crappy endings.
Well, it's like there's also cases like people talk the most about episode 8 of Tengen Toppa Gurren
Yeah.
Lagann. Yeah, they always talk about episode 8. It's a 26 episode show. Like, that's a lot.
Hmm.
That's a lot that happened
Yeah.
after that people are just like, man, but that episode, I felt so many things.
Exactly. So, like, I think it's just imperative, especially with, like, how long it takes to finish this gosh darn thing, to just don't put everything at the end. You don't have to make it like the most epic sauce tear fest. We're all ending it, stuff like that.
Oh my
The
god, and just
readers.
don't. It's gonna be miserable to read before that if you save it all for the very end. What are you gonna put in the other 500 pages?
Exactly. And it's just like, I think if someone is really enjoying your work, like, they're gonna already have those tear jerkers somewhere else in the story. Like, it doesn't have to all be at the end for that. And just try to make it come as naturally as it can. Wrap up a lot of those loose ends that you have, and I would say to plan for an ending, as kind of like a note for it. Even personally, don't. My advice for this is not to change endings based on like reader reactions because you want to be like, so subversive with your plot. I would just stick to what it's supposed to be, and I think that the genuine nature of your story will really shine through.
I think like for me as a reader, the more genuine the ending or the more natural the ending, if there's those tearjerkers or those feelings earlier in the work that you wanted to get across, when that ending happens naturally, the tears will come naturally. The feeling that you want will just happen because readers will pick up on genuine authenticity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just, I think just kind of sticking to that plan. I think that the other thing that's like really important as far as like ending a webcomic um is that it's also very rare. Just because
Yeah.
webcomics are vast. And they, like I said, it took both Thane and I 10 years production to finish Chiralt and Ghost Junk Sickness. And like that's no easy feat. And so, we'll probably touch a little bit on this like near the end of the episode, but don't beat yourself up if you don't get there either.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I feel like I kind of I have two kinds of advice, like two kind of main points, and one of them ties into kind of what Crispy was saying earlier about like not putting everything in at the ending, but like for a longer story, it's a really good idea to practice putting in little payoffs to your arcs throughout. Like just get into that habit. Like if you've set something up, like in ideally kind of in each chapter, because that's sort of the nature of chapters. And it took me a hilariously long time to understand that because tied in with the way I was doing Geralt at the beginning, I was not planning my story by chapters. I was just kind of writing. And then I would arbitrarily be like, and this is the end of a chapter because it's been 32 pages or something. Be like, well, that's it. Even if it was the middle of a scene, I was like, well, I don't actually know what a chapter is for. But as I like looking back at the story, and this is something that I'm thinking about a lot more with Witchwood, my new comic, is just that the nature of a chapter is like it's a piece of the story, and it doesn't need to stand by itself, as in somebody could read just that and like completely disregard the whole rest of it. It depends on the type of story that it is, but ideally at the end of a chapter you should feel like you got something out of it, like something was introduced or concluded, or there was a thought, like a complete thought present in that chapter that is building towards the whole of the story. And getting into practice, like wrapping up little things, like introduce a character's goal, and then when they grow and change that goal, like address that it changed. Don't just kind of slide to the next thing. Like realize what kind of beat that is for the character or for the plot or like whatever that moment is. Like treat it like its own small conclusion and give it that feeling of payoff and satisfaction to the reader. And doing that kind of thing regularly, even if you're making a whole story that you're not planning on ending for another like 5 or 10 years or something, it'll make the process of actually ending the whole thing a little easier because now you have like a creative framework for concluding an idea. And then the other advice is kind of process related, which is just like write things down a lot. I know some people plan things visually without, or like go straight to like the images, but writing is so much faster than that. You can like put out like a whole like little draft or even like a short paragraph that's just like, here's what I want to do. Just like describe it to yourself and then save that description. Even if you change it later, save the old one and add the new one in like another
I
document.
do that
Have, like a
all
little,
the time. Yeah.
yeah. Like I have archive documents that are like, here's like my outline from like 2009 that like it's unrecognizable, but like having that like record of like what I was thinking, sometimes if I go back and look at it, I'll find things in there that can still apply to the story itself or to like later parts of it. Like that thing that was mentioned about putting plot beats into short stories. I literally did that because in volume 3 of Chiralt, I had this whole plan in mind that like either before or after the massive action sequence, like I was like, in this section there's gonna be a big dramatic action sequence, but also maybe like a charming little section where Tico meets like a street cat and like they hang out together. And that ended up getting cut because once I realized I needed to kind of get moving towards the ending with like a bit more purpose, I was like, I can't find a way to put this in, so I removed it from the main story, but I ended up making it into a little short story for like the one of the Spider Forest anthologies and the Creatures one. And that was like, it was a ton of fun to make. That was like 2 years ago, so it was very recent. I was like, I'm gonna revisit these characters, and it was like a lot of fun, very nostalgic, kind of getting back into it. But like I might not have remembered if it hadn't been in my notes at one point. And then the other thing that also ties into the first point that I was talking about building in little payoffs through like the chapter. If something else that can help is just saving whenever you describe the story to somebody else, whether it be on social media, like you wrote a tweet, like, here's my webcomic, it's about this thing, or you're telling somebody in Discord, like, oh yeah, by the way, I'm making my webcomic and it's about this thing. Like all those descriptions, like save those too. Even if they're the earliest ones and you actually haven't nailed down where you're going with it or where it's going to end, what like sort of putting into words what you think your story is about, like these descriptions and how they evolve over time, that can be very helpful both for marketing the story later on down the line, but also just like realizing what you actually are making. If you're an organic writer like me who like kind of goes forward without putting that stuff down ahead of time, like looking at it kind of retroactively and being like, oh, this is a story like that at its core is about like friendship, or that's about like the societal evils of capitalism or something. Like having that in your mind, like knowing what your story is about, is so important to ending it. And even if you don't like have the like space or time or energy, or like you don't feel like sitting down and like grinding out the whole like a whole note thing, just having that little all those little descriptions on hand when you do eventually come around to like, all right, it's time to think about this, having that document can be very useful. And a lot of mine came from conventions, because there's nothing like a convention for forcing you to try to describe your story in 2 sentences or less to like 100 strangers.
Honestly, sometimes just saying it out loud can just get your brain turning on different things of going, hey, wait, now that I say this out loud, it doesn't really match the idea that you had or whatever, and you can then take it and go, okay, how do I adjust this? It's sort of a way to help course correct.
I remember like years ago I was splitting a table with Delphina actually, and I think I had left for something and I came back to find her in the middle of like basically pitching my book to somebody and I was just like, I'm not gonna like it was literally mid sentence, so it was like I didn't have time to like necessarily interrupt, but I was just like, I'm gonna listen. Oh, this is good. I need to save that. So
I wanted to go back, like you mentioned payoffs, and those leaving those little payoffs is also helpful for you as a writer and as a creator, because then like those can be helpful psychological boosts for yourself to help keep you going. It's you're leaving your readers little cookie crumbs, but you're also leaving future you some cookie crumbs. It's win-win.
yes, I love finishing a chapter and having readers be like, "Oh my god, what the heck is gonna happen next?" Or just like flipping out, or like, "Whoa, that was an incredible chapter." It's like that happens when something happens in the chapter, as opposed to in
Things
my
happen when things happen.
yeah,
I love it when things
mind blowing, right?
My favorite part of webcomic is when thing happen.
Excited for more things to happen next.
We're getting to the end of this episode, but not quite yet. So I just wanted to see if there's any final parting words that folks have for folks on ending your comic.
I did want to touch back on that point that I make about folks not getting there at the end of the webcomic. Now, a majority of this episode is to help folks who are getting there or want to get there reach that goal, but like there's also, a lot of webcomics out there that just never do reach that goal or want to continue forever and ever and ever. And I just wanted to say that those are completely valid things that do happen in webcomics a
Absolutely.
lot. One of the really cool things about webcomics is the fact that like it's a medium that like anybody can try. As long as you got like a pen, paper, scanner, phone, whatever, you could just slap that stuff on the web and just kind of have a good old time with it. And
Yeah, our long form, like fantasy epic story bias is definitely showing. Because if you're making a gag a day comic, like feel free to just not think about these things.
Yeah, 100%. And like, there's always going to be a situation in which like, these things don't apply and whatnot. And I think that if ending a webcomic kind of isn't in the cards, or you've walked away from the idea, you don't like the story anymore, um, I think that's just as valid. And I don't think that you should feel like you got to beat yourself up for it if you just don't get there either. Now, if this is something that you're really, really considering, like, you're like, I really want to make like a X amount of pages and go for, whatever. I do want to finish my comic. I don't want to make it this long. Like, I want something finished under my belt. The one thing that I will say for doing this is that it does take a lot of like that discipline, that self-discipline to get there. And I'm not being like, oh my gosh, work yourself to death on something free. But I think for self satisfaction and just really wanting that goal, which is also valid, I think, there are parts where you're just going to have to be like, you know what? This part in the comic is either a drag or it's hard or whatever. And trying to getting over those bumps with like, reworking the process to make it more enjoyable, or just kind of figuring things out so that you can reach that goal, and just keeping your head in the game. One thing that I really encourage folks who are finding it a little bit difficult to stay on top of that is that I really enjoy work sessions that I can be with other creators and doing that. And the Screen Tones Discord has a co-work chat that folks just kind of hop in and stream and chat workshop, and a lot of it gets folks really excited about their web comics. And so if that's something that you feel like, oh, like I really need like a community to kind of help me, like, just stay focused or like be excited, because I know that that's something that like folks can hop out of, especially during social media, making you not feel as cool and worth it sometimes. A lot of that self-doubt plays into it. Just having folks around and just encouraging one another with our web comics really, really helps.
Something that I did actually really start doing towards like the end of Chiralt was that I started seeking critique much more at like earlier and earlier stages of the process. I would get like friends to read over my outlines, and like once I started scripting, I would be like, does this feel like it's hitting the right like beats? And I would try to be as like clear about my goals and intentions in those sections as possible. I mean, I know we talked about this in the critique episode too, but like when I was sending these things over, I would be like, I want to try to, in this section, I'm trying to address the like issues in the past of like these two characters, and like hoping to bring it to something that feels like a kind of resolution, even if it's not perfect. Does this seem like it's meeting that beat? And I would ask like questions about it and kind of listen to like the answers that I was getting, and then take that on board. And having that extra pair of eyes looking at things was also very helpful, because definitely the end of the story is when it's really easy to get into your own head a bit too much.
Absolutely. And speaking as someone who's had to walk away from a comics project, it's very like Crispy was saying, it's very easy to get in your own head and just don't take it too hard. or personally, and walking away from a webcomic is the norm in webcomics. I think it's definitely less than 50% of webcomics that actually reach the finish line, and that's probably a little generous, but walking away from a webcomic is normal, especially if it's your first comic. It's okay to go and realize, okay, I've learned some things from this. I want to do things differently and go back and attack it later. Or like if you've had to walk away from a project for other reasons, it's okay to take some of those ideas, recycle them in later works, and then just keep on going. Like ending a webcomic doesn't get you on like some blacklist of, oh, they've ended a webcomic and walked away. Like it doesn't ban you from trying again. Is what I'm trying to say. And with that, this episode, I think I'm going to call it Chicken Caesar Salad Wrap.
Hell yeah.
You could just call it an ending.
It is an ending. Roll credits. I've been Rennie, and you can find my work at aetherstarcomic.com.
I've been Crispy. You can find my comics at ghostjunksickness.com and lunarblight.com.
And I've been Verathane. You can find my comics at chiralt.sevensmith.net and witchwoodcomic.com.
Well, that's an ending.
That is an ending.
Oh, it's like 5 endings.
That feels good.
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. We are supported in part by the fantastic folks at Hiveworks, home of many amazing independent webcomics. Check out their store at hivemill.com to find ebooks and print books of many fine Hiveworks titles. We're also supported by, well, listeners like you over on Ko-fi. Drop us a few bucks if you enjoy what we do and want to help us continue talking about anything and everything webcomics. And don't forget to give us a follow on Blue Sky and Tumblr so you don't miss an episode. You can find links to all of those at screentonescast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.